Today I'm going to show you how to knit this little top, a cardigan in a newborn size, from beginning to end. You'll need a soft number 4 yarn, otherwise known as worsted weight, and adjust the carriage to get 4 stitches 6 rows per inch. I made the sample on my Studio SK150, that's what you'll be seeing me work on, and I got the gauge at stitch size 5 on the dial. The cardigan finishes to about 18 inches around and 7 inches long. Both of these dolls are pretty close to accurate newborn size, but there are some discrepancies, and I'll point them out so you know what to expect. This doll has a cloth body. The body is more accurately sized than the other doll, but the arms are much chunkier than those of a real newborn. This doll's arms are sized much more like a typical newborn, and her torso is within the range of normal, but it's about an inch slimmer than the average newborn. Both dolls are wearing the companion piece, the ring around a rosy hat, which is the subject of another video. Both written patterns are now part of the baby bundle for sale on my website, which includes 3 other books plus these patterns. And I will put a link for you in the program notes so you can research those if you want. The written cardigan pattern has 2 sizes, but I'm only demonstrating the newborn size here for clarity. You don't need a fancy machine for this, and you don't need a ribber. Let's go over the basic construction. We'll cast on one side of the front, work the hem, and then work up to here. We'll put the needles that knitted that piece in hold and repeat, casting on the other side and knitting up to here, so catching up the fronts to each other. Before moving on with each half of the knitting, we'll cast on some sleeve stitches. We'll then shape the neckline one side at a time. While one side is working, the other needles will be in hold. The dotted line is an imaginary line. It's the shoulder position. We're going to continue knitting right down the back of the garment. And to do that, we move the stitches on one side of the work only over towards the center, one needle, and then cast on new stitches on the needles that were left empty due to the neckline shaping. From now on, the back is knitted all as a single piece. We first knit 6 rows, reform some stitches in the center to create back neck ribbing, continue knitting towards the hem until it's time to bind off the sleeve stitches. Now we knit down to and including the hem rows, create the hem by reforming some columns of stitches as purls and bind off, and voila, that's it. An optional final step is to knit on a little bit of cord for a bow. Starting with the carriage at right, use the main yarn to cast on 20 stitches using the chain stitch cast on. Start at the center of the bed and do all the casting on to the right. Thread the yarn into the carriage and knit 6 rows. Counting in from the side of the work, ladder down and reform every 3rd stitch. Ladder down 5 rows so that you can put your tool into the bottom stitch that was worked straight through the cast on. Reform only 3 columns of stitches because our center front treatment will consume the remainder. Leave 3 plain stitches at the edge of the work. This will become the center front, and make your first cable cross on stitches 4, 5, 6, and 7. To make the cable, we lift those 4 stitches on 2 sets of 2-prong tools, cross the stitches, and replace them on the opposite needles. For this side of the cardigan front, I'm choosing to cross right over left, meaning the right stitches are replaced first. After this first cable cross, we will knit 24 rows, crossing the cable every 4 rows. Here I am completing the final cable cross. Your total row count at this point will be 30. Drop stitch number 3, counting in from the edge near the cable. That's the edge that's going to become the center front. Ladder it all the way down to the first true stitch, the one that was worked right through the cast on. Latch this column of stitches up as a tucked purl. Stick in the tool to that bottom stitch, slide behind one rung, Grab the next rung and pull through. Do this all the way up the column of stitches. When the top is reached, hang the final loop on the original needle, then drop stitch column number 8 and do the same exact thing to it. These tucked columns of purl stitches set apart the cable, making it way more dramatic than it would be without them. Now it's time to start the second side of the front, so place these stitches in hold, set the carriage to hold, and move the carriage across. Now working from the center towards the edge, chain stitch around 20 more needle shanks to begin the second side of the front. Set the row counter to 0. The stitches that we've already worked on for the lower part of the front need to stay in hold, so nudge the new needles back into upper working position to begin. Knit 6 rows and create the hem as for the other side, relatching every third column of stitches for only 3 columns. Our cable treatment will take up the remainder of the lower front. Repeat everything that you did on the first side of the front in mirror image, working a cable on needles 4 through 7, counting in from the center, and working tucked purl columns after all of the rows are knitted on needles 3 and 8, counting in from the center. If you are up to the task, create the cables as mirror images of one another. That will look a little bit more polished on the finished garment. See how both of these cables appear to twist inward? That is because I worked this one right over left and this one left over right. If this is your very first cabled project, I wouldn't bother trying to make the cables mirror image. You will be doing a nice job to get 2 successful cables. It is something for more experienced knitters to consider. I've worked up the front, we're at row 30 again, and I'm now making the final cable cross in this batch. Left tool is getting replaced first on the needles, right tool is getting replaced second. Now it's time to cast on the sleeves. With the working yarn still attached, double E-wrap 12 new needles. The group of stitches for the right front are still in hold. We'll knit 2 plain rows here, and then we're going to begin the neck shaping while simultaneously knitting the cable. If you have 2 5-prong tools, that's the easiest way to keep your count working right. But this may be done with any transfer tools you have. It's a gigantic full fashion decrease in which we move all 10 edge stitches over 1 stitch or 1 needle space away from the center. Do this every other row 6 times. Because the decrease is 10 stitches wide, we have room to continue working our cable as well as our tuck purl columns. Because the cable crosses are every 4 rows and the decreases are every 2 rows, half of the time a cable cross is called for on the same row as a decrease. When that happens, always do the decrease first. You could technically do it the other way, but that would mean that we would have to move stitches that had been cabled and they'd be tight. Why make it hard on ourselves? So continue decreasing while cabling, decreasing every other row 6 times, cabling every 4th row. Here's the final cable cross. After this, we're going to knit 2 plain rows. There should now be 6 empty needles between the 2 groups of stitches. Ladder down stitch 3 and stitch 8, which will be the same columns of stitches we worked on before, and finish the tucked purls. Now place all of the needles that just knitted into hold and move the carriage back across to the right. Repeat everything you just did, casting on another 12 stitches to begin the sleeve, working the neckline shaping, working the cable and the tucked purl columns of stitches up the center front for the right hand front of the cardigan. There should now be 12 empty needles between the 2 pieces of knitting, and we want to reduce that space to 11. So pick one side or the other of the cardigan fronts and move all the stitches 1 needle towards the center. Now cast on across those 11 needles using chain stitch, but begin and end on a needle that already has a stitch to securely anchor the back neckline, which this cast-on represents, to the remainder of the garment. We'll begin the back by knitting 6 plain rows. Find the very center stitch, double check that it is the center, ladder down to the first row of real stitches that work through the cast-on, and reform every other stitch across the 11 stitch back neck span to become a purl stitch. So we'll get a little bit of back neck ribbing, and the garment will come off of the machine with the back neck complete. Knit 8 plain rows and then a 9th row to the left, stopping there. We'll do a little wrist treatment on the 4th stitch from each edge of the sleeve. Ladder it down to the first true stitch, and again we will relatch as a purl. But this time we will literally latch 2 rungs at a time, drawing in the wrist just a little bit. And as usual, hang the final stitch on the original needle. Bind off the 12 stitches that we added to create the sleeve, then knit across to the right, drop and relatch the 4th stitch, and bind off the 12 stitches that represent the sleeve. At this point, you've done all the hard stuff. We'll knit straight down 30 plain rows to the bottom of the hem. Find the center stitch, ladder it down, latch it back up as a purl. We're making ribbing that's going to match the ribbing on the front. Ladder down 5 rows because that's what we had to latch up on the front. Every 3rd stitch gets this treatment. Starting in the center, we'll create ribbing that is symmetrical at the side seams. When the hem is complete, bind off around the gate pegs is my choice, but any chain stitch producing method is fine. Ties in the front are optional, but I decided to count up to make my ties even with the 6th cable cross. Hang the edge of the fabric on 3 needles, knit 30 stockinette rows, which makes a little cord, and then pull the yarn tail through all the stitches and knot it and weave it in. Make a matching cord on the other side, of course. Give all the ribbing and the cable a lengthwise tug. Seam the garment together up the sides and across the underarm. I liked backstitch for this project, but your own tidy preference is just fine. The written pattern includes a 2nd size, which fits a 3 to 6 month old child on average. The techniques are identical. Your row counts and stitch counts will be slightly different.